Welcome back to America's Fractured Politics. Today I'm joined by Keith Bumgarner. A few weeks ago, Keith, Richard Gross, and I had a lively discussion about politics. Today's podcast, though, will focus on something infinitely more personal: fractured lives. The Epstein Files cover-up and the recent survivors' press conference has emotionally triggered thousands of sexual abuse victims nationwide. But another cover-up deserves exposure: the systematic dismissal of male survivors, particularly when their abusers are women. When boys report sexual exploitation by adult female predators, they're told they quote-unquote got lucky rather than receiving support. This cultural blindness leaves an entire demographic of survivors invisible and voiceless. Keith has courageously agreed to discuss his traumatic journey through the nightmare of sexual abuse, but in this case, an abuse that is different than that which we conventionally understand and is yet equally horrible. Keith, welcome and thank you for doing this. I want to start at the beginning. What were the circumstances of your first sexual abuse and who was responsible? How old were you when this first occurred?
Well, unfortunately, Mark, and first let me say good morning. I was 10 years old. It turned out it was a 19-year-old woman who was babysitting my younger siblings. And it went on until, just before my 13th birthday with this same woman. Shortly, still right before my 13th birthday even, I had a 12-year-old girlfriend, like most people do in grammar school, but her 18-year-old sister seduced me. And from there on, it was just sort of a downhill slide. There was a number of girls that were 3 and 4 years older than me, and the adult women started with a 24-year-old teacher shortly after turning 16. From there, it kind of flipped into a sexual addiction. And there were many other adult women, including 2 more teachers. And admittedly, what has been very shameful for me over the years, a few friends' mothers. In fact, one of them was an alcoholic. And I always wondered, and I've talked with my therapist about this many times, if I indeed had been if I was the predator, had I taken advantage of her because of her substance abuse. A lot of guilt, a lot of shame that goes along with these kinds of things. Probably before I was 20 years old, I had maybe slept with close to 60 different women.
Wow. I guess it leads into another question. Did any of these women know each other?
Yes, actually, 2 of the teachers knew each other. And I was able to find out about 10 years ago, under some even more tragic circumstances, that one of them had remarked to another one that I was a quote unquote easy mark. Now, that easy mark was probably because I lived alone. From the time just before my 16th birthday, I was living alone. I had left my family, or more specifically, they had abandoned me. And I was truly living alone. I wasn't living with friends or anyone who took me in. I had a house and I lived alone for the last 2 years of high school. That's not a good thing for a 16 and a 17-year-old kid. And there was a lot of problems that came from that.
Aside from your own particular situation, do you think there's anything that makes people, especially males, more vulnerable to sexual predators?
Well, I think one of the first and most important things is that oftentimes, and research shows that potentially over 80% of the men who are sexually abused by adult perpetrators or develop a sexual addiction, they were physically abused as children. What happens with a child when they're physically abused, and I indeed was severely physically abused, is that you realize that there's one thing that you want more than anything in your entire life. And Mark, that's kindness. You're extended no kindness in a household where you're being physically abused by one parent and the other parent simply either watches or lets it go on. And that's exactly what I had. And when a sexual predator extends some kindness, if they hug you, if they tell you what a special little boy you are, and I heard it all, then you gravitate to that. You want some kind of love and kindness extended to you so bad that you're willing to be violated like that. And I think this is what most likely makes young boys and adolescents vulnerable to sexual abuse.
Tragic. It's tragic that people have to suffer without that kindness, and it's tragic that it has to end up this way. Why are males the forgotten ones in the sexual abuse equation?
Well, it's pretty typical. In our society, we assume that the man is the stronger one, that the woman is, the more frail, that the man is the sexual aggressor, that men always want sex under any circumstances, no matter what's going on. And so it's very, very hard for some people to accept the fact that a woman might abuse a man and ultimately not be exactly what the man, or in my case, young boy or adolescent boy, wanted. And then you run into all kinds of things like, people saying, "Oh my God, you were so lucky," or "Man, I wish I could have, swapped places with you. That's amazing." Or, "Oh, I think my favorite is, man, way to go." Um, I've even heard this from women. I've sat in a couple of sessions with therapists where the therapist was a woman and they did not consider this actual sexual abuse when a 31 or a 34-year-old woman or a 40-year-old woman takes a 16-year-old boy and sexually abuses them. I think this is the biggest problem for men. Men also, too, are reluctant to come forward with these kind of things. They're embarrassed. They feel shame. They think, "Oh, well, I'll be ridiculed by other men or by my friends in regards to, coming forward with these kinds of things." And I think there's countless therapists out there that will tell you that it's extremely difficult for a man to come forward to talk about things like this.
That therapist was guilty of gross malpractice. I don't know what else to say. What environments are more likely to facilitate sexual abuse of males by adult women? How does that happen?
Well, in my particular case, obviously it was a babysitter and then teachers. But what that means is these are always females who are in authority position over a male that's under their supervision. And it's often small children. It often is adolescent boys. It happens in our school systems. It happens in our churches. I'd have to say that almost any environment where young boys or adolescent boys can be caught in situations where they are alone with authoritarian or authoritarian female figures, that there's a good chance that there could very well be some sexual abuse that comes out of those environments. That's why it's so incredibly important for parents to look for signs, to understand what might be going on, to be sure that when they let their young son or even daughter, be in the company of adults where the adult is in an authority position, they need to really know exactly what's going on. They shouldn't be embarrassed to ask any and every question that they need to ask. If my parents had been paying any attention, and my parents didn't give a damn, if they'd been paying any attention whatsoever, they probably could have picked up several signals of what was going on with me.
This is difficult. Difficult for you, but it's difficult for somebody interviewing you too, because when you hear this and you're not used to hearing about it, it really jars your sensibilities, and it makes you wonder about human beings. Another question that kind of presents itself after what you just said: how do the approaches happen? How do they come about approaching you? How do they go about approaching you?
Oh my gosh. Well, as I said, when I was 10 years old, it was a babysitter. And it, and this particular babysitter paid a lot of attention to me before she sort of sprang into action, so to speak. Um, and of course, that's that's where you're trapped. That's how the predators work. They manipulate you to a point where you you want to be with them. You feel like this particular person is showing you more attention, is showering more love on you than your parents are, or any other adults around you who, frankly, are responsible for you. Um,
They're sort of giving you
and
permission, aren't they?
excuse
So
me.
they're kind of giving you permission, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're inviting you in, and they're a little bit slow. I mean, it's very methodical. I wrote a piece on Substack a few months ago called "The Note," and it's about how my 24-year-old teacher methodically and step by step manipulated me, groomed me, and set me up for sexual abuse. It came over a period of several days. When you read what I wrote, and now I know how those steps proceed, you can see that these people think these things out. They think, what is the best way to approach a child? What's the best way to lure an adolescent, a teenage boy into their clutches, so to speak? It's very, the evil lies in how premeditated it is, Mark. These people know exactly what they're doing.
This lends me, this lends itself to a question. Based on your experience with these women, and based on what you've seen, and your clearly strong observational skills, what type of women does this? What sort of personality type seems to lend itself to this sort of behavior?
Well, there seems to be a consensus in that most of these women are emotionally damaged in some way. They feel like they have no agency in their own life. Maybe they've been abused themselves. I don't know. I have a hard time trying to give any of them a pass. Um, I'm sure that there may be some very good reasons why these women do this. Uh, but I look at my own self, and I was repeatedly sexually abused, and I never had any desire or an intention whatsoever to sexually abuse anyone else. So it's hard for me to give them a pass. But I would always see that these people were somehow emotionally damaged. Mark, trauma recognizes trauma. And when I became an adolescent, when I was in high school, I actually became a master at detecting women that were damaged in this way. And only the ones that were severely damaged seemed to be the ones that would gravitate toward wanting to have some kind of sexual relationship with me. Um, no healthy, mentally stable individual is going to do anything like this, Mark.
No. Um, and it just seems like they had a radar for you, um, that they had a radar for your
Yeah,
damage.
yeah, that's exactly that. And as I said, trauma recognizes trauma, so that cuts both ways. These people recognized that I was a kid who probably had never experienced parental love, um, very little kindness in my life, and that's what they swoop in on. They are definitely predators. It's just like a jaguar leaping out of a tree onto a helpless deer or something. It's just that they're predators, Mark.
So, what are the consequences for males who've been sexually abused? I mean, what's the fallout? How can physical and sexual abuse lead to sexual addiction? Because that's something that I think that sort of presents itself as a logical consequence. I've known people who've had psychological problems with abuse, not necessarily the same as this, but who become sexually addicted afterward.
Yeah, Dr. Patrick Carnes has done a tremendous amount of research into the sexual addiction of males. And in his research, he's discovered that 81% of men who were sexually abused and physically abused, by the way, um, turn out to have some form or level of sexual addiction. What happens is, especially when this happens as young as I was at age 10, um, from a physiological standpoint, your body and your mind, more importantly, at that age, is not prepared for persistent, frequent sexual arousal. When this happens, it sort of rewires parts of your brain. Um, it causes you to have a much greater proclivity to have sexual interaction with other people. The other thing that happens is these same kids like myself who were physically abused, you've got emotional pain heaped on top of emotional pain. The layers of trauma are unconscionable, Mark. And what you're doing as a child and then ultimately as an adolescent is you're looking for pleasure moments because you need some respite from this. You've got to stop that pain. You've got to stop those noises in your head that are just coming down on top of you with I don't even know how to describe it. And the thing about having sex is when you have a sexual climax, everybody knows there's a great period of euphoria, et cetera, et cetera. So the addiction is to that euphoria. That euphoria is putting away all of your emotional pain for a brief period of time. And the brief period of time is the operative phrase here, because when you feel this and you sense this and you say, oh my God, I feel so much better, you've got to have it again and again and again and again. And it's the only thing you know. It's the only intimacy you've been taught. It's the only thing that your brain is set up to receive.
This is a tough question, but it sort of flows from the rest of this. Did you ever consider suicide?
Absolutely. More times than you can possibly know. And in fact, in the midst of this abuse and sexual addiction, I tried to take my own life when I was 17 years old. I was only unsuccessful because a woman who was a guardian angel of mine, actually her and her husband both, sort of kept an eye out for me, maybe the only two adults that did at that time. She found me on the floor of my home because she swung by one evening to see if I needed maybe help with getting my clothes washed or something like that. It was just her habit to every once in a while swing by. And I had given her a key sometime before that. She came by, she opened up the kitchen door, and she found me on the kitchen floor. I had consumed an incredible amount of Quaaludes. She got me to the hospital. Ended up being in the hospital for several days. And I realized, after I made that attempt, it sort of steeled myself. I said, I'm not going to let this happen to me again. But I can't tell you how many countless times after that I thought about suicide. Now, if you want to talk about statistics, men who have been abused more than 7 times, and you can find this at the CDC and a whole host of other places that have done the research, are 31 times more likely to consider suicide than anyone in the average population. 31 times more. And yes, it has occurred to me more times than I would like to admit.
I guess a logical question is, as you've grown up and you've grown older, how has this affected your life and the lives of those around you?
Oh God, Mark. I could talk to you for hours about that, but let me push the number one thing up to the top. This has affected my dear wife like you can't imagine. This woman was someone who, when I was 20 years old, essentially rescued me. We've been married now for 50 years. But during that time, I've got to say, staying married to me and being married to me and being with me, it ain't for amateurs, I assure you. It got so bad that back in 2017, my wife and I separated for almost a year. One thing that led up to that is that one of the teachers that I had been groomed by in high school, I discovered on my 60th birthday on a phone call that both my wife and I heard that her youngest child was actually mine. And of course, that, as you know, could potentially, cause damage to almost any relationship, any marriage.
Yeah.
And it, and the idea, this woman, I found out later, she was actually on her deathbed. So she was obviously, calling people and I don't know what she was trying to do, clear her conscience, whatever. But in the process of clearing her conscience, she wrecked our lives, mine and my wife's lives. And and the idea that there's actually a child out there that was the result of all of this, that has been one of the most difficult things. Excuse me, Mark. That's been one of the most difficult things that I think I've ever had to deal with in my entire life. And of course, this child doesn't know this, and they will never know this because this child thinks that the man who raised her is her father, and that's the way it should be. This isn't a case of someone looking, for, a birth parent or anything like this. This is a case of just realizing that the only thing that absolutely matters is the welfare of that other person. And it'll stay. No one will ever know who that is, as far as I'm concerned.
That woman was selfish from beginning to end, wasn't she?
Oh my God. Her selfishness knew no bounds. And I'm not even sure there's a word for it, Mark. My wife wanted to literally drive to her home and beat the hell out of her. And I can't say I blame that son.
How did you come back from this? How have you dealt with it? How have you built a successful life?
Well, it hasn't been easy. There were a few adults in my life that looked in on me, checked on me. I had grandparents, my maternal grandparents. My grandfather might have been the most decent, honorable man. I'm sorry, Mark,
That's all right.
that I've ever known. And I didn't get to spend enough time with him, but when I was with him, it was the only time that I really knew that I was actually loved by somebody at that age. And so I at least had that. And I took myself to a therapist for the first time, Mark, when I was 17 years old. Now, I knew I was a mess. My therapist that I have now, who is one of the most compassionate, um, patient therapists I've ever known, with great expertise and much experience in this regard. Her name is Kim Asher. She said I could freely use her name. She's here in the Atlanta area. She told me that my extreme self-awareness and my intelligence is two factors that definitely saved me. She said your intelligence allowed you to disassociate to the point where you could go in your mind to other places and essentially almost assume another identity, which is what protects you in a lot of these particular cases. Believe it or not, I've gone through 11 therapists in my life from the time I was 17 years old. I had enough self-awareness and intelligence to know which ones weren't helping me. For years and years, no one even recognized what my problem was. And in fact, one of the therapists was a woman who attempted to have an affair with me when I was in there talking with her about being abused by women in authority positions.
For heaven's sake.
Okay, so therapists are obviously as fallible as anyone else, but you have to be extremely careful. And, you tell people to get help, but you've got to get help from the right people. And the right people starts with looking for people who can treat a specific problem. Typically, people like me are suffering from what's called complex PTSD. You have to first find a therapist who has experience and expertise in regards to complex PTSD. It's also important maybe that you ask them and talk to them. Have they, treated other clients or patients in regards to sexual abuse as a child or as an adolescent? Um, it's as I said, it's difficult. And sometimes it's a matter of cost. Therapists aren't cheap, but there's so many resources that you can freely get help from. And I want to put together a post that you and I can jointly put out there, Mark, where people can see all the different places that they might be able to find some resources that will help them. There's always some way to find the help out there if you want to step up and say, I need help.
Be happy to help.
And of course, that's a tough thing for a lot of men, a very tough thing for a lot of men. But they can't be they can't be ashamed. They can't be embarrassed. And one of the key things, Mark, if I might say this too, my current therapist taught me the difference between shame and guilt. Shame is when you're a bad person and you've done something bad. Guilt is simply any good, decent person who's done something bad. Predators try to make you feel shame. Shame is one of the ways they control you. Shame is one of the ways they keep you in the fold, so to speak. And the day that you understand that there's a difference between shame and guilt is how you get on the road to healing and how you get on the road to the most important thing you can always remember about this is it wasn't your fault. You didn't do it. These were adults. You were a kid. They should have known better. You couldn't have known better.
Very powerful. It's very traumatic for those who listen to it. And I would wonder, you've touched on this, but I'd ask you to expand a little bit. What would you advise anybody who's listening, who's going through this, to do right now, no matter what age they might be?
I think they need to, if they have someone in their life that they know cares and loves for them very deeply and does not judge, I think the first thing they need to do, if they haven't already done this, is talk to that person. Tell that person what happened. The second thing they need to do is see if they can find therapy. Now, one great resource that I can mention right now is a website called oneinsix.org. It gets its name from the fact that 1 in 6 men have been sexually abused in this country. There's a lot of other help out there, but you really need to see if there's that one person who cares and loves you and will not judge, and sit down and talk with them. If that person doesn't exist, then you need to find some resource. And there's so much of this online where you can find somebody to talk to. You can go to the rainn.org site and you can talk to someone on the phone about it. There's no charge for most of this stuff, Mark. You don't need money. You just need to have enough courage to pick up the phone.
1 in 6 is www, the number 1, the letters IN, and the number 6.com, right? Or .org.
.org.
Okay.
Exactly.
1in6.org.
Exactly. And that's a fantastic place for men to start. But there are also other sites for men. Kim Asher has shared with me many of these resources, and I plan to put these resources together in a post that I will very soon put on Substack and also share with you. And I hope that you'll also be willing to post that on your Substack.
I will do it. Any final thoughts?
Well, when I was sitting there watching the Epstein press conference the other day, as much as it triggered me, I realized that we're not alone anymore. And the person who sits there and that has been, troubled and afflicted by this for most of their life, just realize you're not alone. There are thousands of men walking around with my exact problem. You're not alone. Come forward, talk to somebody. Just remember, you're not alone.
I don't know what to say. This has been one of the most enlightening, traumatic, certainly difficult half hours I've ever done on a podcast. And I want to thank you for doing this. I think other people who have been abused should thank you for doing it. And I hope this brings you a sort of catharsis that you need and deserve, and that you'll continue to do this, because healing really comes from opening up. And I really hope that people who are listening will listen with an open mind and understand that this is not just some aberration. This happens, and it happens to a lot of people, and there are a lot of people who are too ashamed to talk about it. And in my mind, Keith deserves a lot of credit for having done so. This has been America's Fractured Politics. I'm glad we ventured into a different area today. We'll be back with more next week. Keith, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And I just want to say one other quick thing. I appreciate so much you allowing me to do this, giving me a platform. Men need a voice.
Men do need a voice, and I'm glad you lent yours to this. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.